Hi, I'm James McCall, and I'm going to start us off today with a couple questions for the audience. First of all, how many people here think of themselves as good people? My second question, how many people here consider themselves racist? Now, according to this small survey, 100% of people think of themselves as good people, while 0% of people consider themselves racist. Though this is an incredibly small survey size, it gets at one of the biggest problems that America is facing today. Yes, Aidan.
Well, what is that problem?
Well, let me tell you. Hi, I'm Billy Naiman.
And I'm Aidan Lane.
And we're here to talk about implicit racial bias.
Now, in the early history of racism, people had no problem expressing their racist beliefs, which leads to the incredibly racist people that you think of when you hear the word racist. KKK members, members of the police that were blocking the Selma March, and so on. However, because it's no longer culturally acceptable to be racist, these overt racists that you think of are disappearing like that. However, that does not mean that racism has disappeared as well. The legacy is carried on through implicit racial bias, a problem that, according to Yale psychologist John DeVidio, is a problem that 66 to 75% of Americans have. Now, before we go on, it's important to define what implicit racial bias actually is. According to the Ohio State Kirwan Institute, implicit racial bias is the mental process that stimulates negative attitudes about people who are not members of one's own in-group. In this case, the members that are not part of our own in-group are African Americans. Now, the Kirwan Institute goes on to explain that these stereotypes affect our understanding, action, and decision in an unconscious manner. Now, this is one of the most dangerous parts about this type of racism, because as you saw through our beginning survey, most people consider themselves good people who are racially unbiased. They have no idea that their decisions that they're making every day have this implicit racial bias acting on them. Now, for example, a 2015 study by UCLA researchers found that interviewers are more likely to associate black-sounding names like Jamal and Deshaun with larger, more violent people than white-sounding names like Connor and Wyatt. Colin Holbrook, the psychologist leading the study, stated that a character with a black-sounding name was assumed to be physically larger, more prone to aggression, and lower in status than a character with a white-sounding name. Now, decisions like these are made every single day. And they're completely based off of these stereotypes. And the worst part about this, as we explained earlier, people have no idea that the decisions that they're making are racist. So where do we go from here? Well, to start, it's absolutely vital that you acknowledge that you probably hold some form of implicit racial bias. Now, that's not a bad thing. The formation of this implicit racial bias is a completely natural process that happens over life. Two psychologists, Andrew Scott Barron and Mazarin R. Benangi, conducted a study on 6-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and adults to study the difference in explicit racial bias and implicit racial bias between all of these people. And they found that at just 6 years old, a year after people are thought to form a mature conception of what race is, these 6-year-olds already had this implicit racial bias present in them. And this amount of implicit racial bias stayed consistent throughout people's lives. So it's really an inevitable process. However, I'm not defending racism, of course. Racism is not okay. However, I'm simply saying that the stigma should not necessarily be around having implicit racial biases, as most people do. It should be around doing nothing to cure them. So how do you cure them? Well, I'm going to hand it over to my friend Aidan Lane to discuss some of these methods and strategies.
Now, most Americans agree that racism is bad and something must be done about the overall racist attitude in America. However, most of the efforts towards stemming racism comes by combating explicit racism instead of implicit racial biases, even though people are much more often affected by these implicit biases. Now, because of that, I'm going to give you some strategies to combat your own implicit biases. Now, the first step of combating your implicit biases is to realize that you have them. Now, this is often the hardest step because these implicit biases operate on the subconscious level, so it's hard to realize you have them. But you all have an advantage because, as James said, the majority of Americans have these implicit biases, and now that you know that, you'll go into this thinking that you most likely have some biases instead of thinking that you are completely fair. Now, just in case you aren't sure, I'm going to give you something to think about so that you can realize and start to reduce your implicit racial biases. Now, imagine you see a member of a different group and you do something differently than you normally would. I want you to stop and think about why you did that. Now, here's a specific example. Picture yourself walking down the street, you see a black man walking towards you on the same side. Without thinking about it, you cross over the other side of the street. That moment, I want you to stop and think about why you did that. What was it about that man that made you want to cross the street? Did you think he was dangerous? That might be the conclusion you come to. But did you just think he was dangerous because he was black? Or did he actually look dangerous? Would you have done something differently if it was a white man walking towards you instead of a black person? And once you've thought about this, you might realize that, in fact, there was something about him that made you want to cross the street, or much more likely, it was just you had implicit biases, and now that you stop to think about it, you've realized that you have these biases. Now, the next step is to come up with counterexamples to certain stereotypes of groups. So one way to do this is to think about someone. You can either know them personally, or they can be famous, just like someone that you know things about, and think about stuff that they do that opposes these stereotypes, and start to replace these stereotypes with the counterexamples that you've come up with. Now, after you do that, you need to start individuating members of groups. So, what is individuation, you might ask? Individuation is a process of removing group stereotypes by seeking out specific information about members of a group. Once you have individuated people, you will start to recognize people based on their personal attributes instead of societal stereotypes. And once you've started the process of individuation, your brain will automatically start seeking out this specific information, and you will become less receptive to stereotypes. Along with individuation comes forming connections with certain groups of people. Now, it's not enough to simply be associates with people of other races. You need to actually form meaningful connections to start breaking down these implicit biases. But once you've done that and you've formed meaningful connections with these people, your brain will start recognizing them and also all of the people of their group as better people, since you have formed meaningful connections and you are friends with people of different groups.
Hiya. Now let's see how all this pertains to New Trier. What's the percentage of white students at New Trier, you might ask? Great question. The answer is 83.8% as of the 2017-2018 school year. That's 3,357 students, which is much larger than the 24 African American students that attended New Trier in 2018. Compared to the rest of the state of Illinois, New Trier has a 35.3% higher population of white students and a 16.4% lower population of black students, while a 21.8% lower population of Latino students. That's where the importance of this whole TED Talk lies. New Trier is the perfect breeding ground for implicit racial biases with primarily democratic political views. It's easy for more people to assume that they've been racially unbiased. However, because of this uneven distribution of race seen at New Trier, white students largely rely on the media when forming their views on African Americans, which has portrayed them in a primarily negative light, and therefore kindles strong implicit racial biases. We are the people who have to be the most educated about our biases. Because you were 6 years old when you begin to develop implicit biases, schools are the most important tool in molding how you can change your implicit racial biases, as otherwise students are never given a chance. American Studies already does a unit on the Jim Crow era and explicit racism, so it would be very easy to implement an implicit racism unit after that one. Because most of that unit was based on the earlier years of our country's history, we didn't delve into the implicit racism of the present day and how it pertains to New Trier students. Now, I know what you're thinking, but Billy, we studied the implicit racism of the prison system and how that was established in the 1980s and how it continues to wrongfully sentence African American and Latino people. Gosh, Not only this, but we've studied examples of racism at high schools and the one in Wisconsin. This is true. We did study these examples of modern-day racism, but none of these examples dealt directly with students of New Trier, and it was therefore easy for us to say, wow, there's still racism today, but I'm not racist at all, so I'm not contributing to the problem and don't need to think about it or solve it. If we can increase awareness of our own implicit racial biases, people will see that this epidemic of implicit racism directly deals with them and will then motivate them to actively strive to change it. In addition to this unit, we would teach New Trier students how they can change their biases so they're more accepting and fit to function in the real multicultural world, not just our small North Shore bubble.
Now this TED Talk will be exactly what you make of it. If you take the points that we just made as offensive, as accusations, then you probably won't gain anything from it. Maybe you think that you still don't have implicit racial biases. But, based off the fact that we live in a primarily white community, and 66 to 75% of white Americans, according to John DeVito, have implicit racial biases, you're probably wrong. Now, if you take the points that we just made as constructive criticism, then you can truly start to embark on your journey of fixing your implicit racial biases.
If you individuate people, form meaningful connections with members of other groups, replace your stereotypes with counterexamples you've come up with, and also internalize your interactions with other races and analyze them to see if you are implicitly biased, then you can start reducing or even eliminating your implicit racial biases.
Because implicit racial biases are most prevalent in primarily white communities, and the New Trier community is primarily white, it is very likely that we do have implicit racial biases, and that's why it's incredibly pertinent that we educate our students on implicit racial biases in American Studies. We do a Jim Crow era and racism unit, and it would be very easy to implement it right at the end. Thank you very much for coming to our TED Talk.